Welcome to the Sage Thought Leadership Podcast, building experiences that connect, remove friction, and deliver insights. Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. I'm Ed Kless, and I'm here live at AICPA Engage 2022. My guest right now is Ian Vacin from Karbon. Welcome to the Sage Thought Leadership Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Ed. I'm super excited to be here. Super excited to actually be three-dimensional with you and be on the floor at the AICPA Engage conference.
I've been saying it's good to be seen, not just viewed.
You know what? You're not on a screen that's literally the size of a 6 by 9 inch square.
It's crazy, but it is good to be back. And wanted to ask you, so why do you do what you do?
I was having this conversation with you a little bit earlier, but again with some folks last weekend when we had some folks together from our conference. But, where I came into what we do is actually my passion stemmed from the fact of I was unsuccessful with my own business forays back in the 90s. I decided that I was going to take over some leadership roles, and I learned that the finance function is extremely important for a business when the company that I worked for ultimately had a VC that embezzled the money, ran off. And we had $3 million in the bank one day, $0 the next. Spent 9 months getting bridge loans. We had all our credit cards on the table. I walked away. We ended up laying off over 100 people. It was probably the lowest point that I've ever had. And I decided at that point that I would go back to grad school, try to learn from my mistakes. That was a very humbling moment, and that I would dedicate what I would do to understand the importance of finance, understand the importance of the partners that work with you in a business front, and support them so that someone else wouldn't have to go through the same experience I did. And that's what started my career, and it's now culminated to 20 plus years in the profession, and running Karbon these days.
And briefly, what would you describe what Karbon does?
Karbon, now we've always talked about as workflow management or work management. We're now, the practice management term I think has been thrown around a bit. I think that has many different connotations, but we're how work gets done. We're not where it gets done. You're going to do that within the different systems that you prefer to use. But we're there on that left screen, helping you know what you're doing next, prioritizing your day, being able to coordinate that between your team members and with your clients so that you ultimately have all the context you need so you can actually move things forward.
And one of the big things, the challenges that I think a lot of folks face, not only just in the accounting space, but I guess any place where knowledge workers congregate, is capacity planning.
Yeah. And
you've been doing a lot of thinking about that recently. So tell me what's your latest thoughts on capacity?
So we've had this back and forth. Okay, so it goes back to the billable hour. We've talked about this at length, and I've struggled with the concept of what are you billing for, but understanding what is your velocity, what is your resources, what are you able to attain from the system that you've put in place. And I mean system in terms of both people and technology, people primarily. And so you have a resource pool. And so how do you distribute that resource pool in a dynamic environment? When you're working in the accounting profession, you're working at knowledge work. Work moves around. It doesn't stay always in the same place. When I was in manufacturing, it's a work line.
It's an assembly line.
It's an assembly line. When I was doing semiconductor, you knew what the aligner did. You knew what the developer did. You knew when it went into the post process. It's a very defined process. You can measure it. You sit there with a stopwatch and you know exactly what it's going to do. And you were talking about the goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you look at capacity planning and you look at how do you do the modeling of a Kanban system just in time. It's quite easy to do that. But when you're dealing with people, there's variability. When you're dealing with work that can be assimilated by different people, and you have people who go out because they're sick, or they've taken the day off, everything gets upended, and so capacity becomes a much more amorphous thing. But it's not as complicated as I think it needs to be. And so we've been working pretty heavily on trying to understand, how do we make that super simple for somebody so they know, well, it's not just what I work on this month, but what I work on this quarter. What does next quarter look like? What do I need to think about resource-wise do I need to add? How is my mix going to change? What is the pool that I have? How do I cross-train? How do I make sure that I'm able to protect myself? This actually, memorable moment with you and with Ron Baker, which was the analogy of the airline. Do you remember this?
Oh, yeah.
And so the easy answer...
Adaptive capacity.
And, it came down, it sticks with me today. I still use it in slides. Always plan your capacity to be at 85% to allow for those first-class seats so you can bring somebody on. So I think that is the simplification answer. But for me as an academic, I want to get to the definitive answer, which is I want to get to 99%, right? within the capacity that's allocated. That still might be that 85%.
You don't want 99% capacity. No, right.
I want 99%. I guess I'm going to use the word utilization, which I don't want to use.
Right.
But of the 85% that you've allocated, because you always need to have that excess capacity that you're going to use for work on your firm, or you're going to take on that new client. Mm-hmm. But how do you know predictively that you're going to get to that maximum quantity that you want? And that's what I've been maniacally trying to think through. And you and I have talked about it.
Yeah. Because it really is, the analogy Ron and I use is it's not timesheets. It's timesheets in advance, which is a far different concept. And people are like, well, no, it's the same thing. No, it is very, very different.
Yeah. What I did in the past doesn't necessarily where I'm going forward. I should be hopefully accelerating. Mm-hmm. And, if I have an effective billing rate, it's not necessarily the best thing, but my effective billing rate should increase over time as I become more capable, become more knowledgeable, right? And so looking backwards doesn't necessarily tell you what you're doing forwards. However, you want to be looking at what your prior progress has been or what you're trending so that you can better estimate your budgets. Mm-hmm. Now, where it gets a little bit funky is, Ed, you're much more capable than I am. I'm a bit slower, and so, people are different, and you have to be able to understand that and understand how you're going to allocate them. It gets more complicated the smaller the firm is because you're wearing many hats. It gets a little bit easier when it's bigger because you're more isolated and allocated into a particular spot. But there's that variation that makes those models more complicated. The bigger the data set, the longer that you look out, the easier it becomes because the big data washes itself. You're going to make mistakes on one side of it and make mistakes the other, and generally it balances out. But the more granular and more finite and the smaller the time horizon is, the more variability that you might have and complications.
Let me ask you a question that might be a little bit out of left field.
Did I go way academic on this?
No, this is outstanding. Let me ask you a question because this is Ron and I have been Ron Baker, the guy I do the Soul of Enterprise with.
Great podcast, by the way.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
But we've been thinking about this, moving professional firms to the subscription model.
Yes,
which changes it because one of the things we used to say is with pricing by the hour, you are pricing the services. You don't want to do that. What we said is we wanted you to price the customer in value pricing.
Right.
But in subscription, what our mantra is, no, you want to price the portfolio. Mm-hmm. Meaning you're going to spread your prices across a portfolio, a pool, a risk pool.
Yep.
If that's the case, it might diminish the importance of capacity planning to some extent because now you're not looking at the individual engagements. You're looking at this as more of a pool, which is in alignment with what you're saying, the flow.
I got to disagree.
And then you can push. No, I'm pushing back.
I'm going to disagree. So here's the complexity of that particular viewpoint. So we have this issue where you have bundled services and you have a subscription, and now I'm trying to figure out a cost, right? Well, what is the monthly accounting service versus what is the quarterly year-end? And then now I've got to do this sort of guesstimate of what the allocation is. I agree, that's a disaster, right? You're just going to go down. You're going to go down. You're going to go down, Rob. Well, it doesn't matter. It's whatever they're paying up front. But where the issue comes in is now, depending on the size of the firm, you have allocation of resources of different types that need to be isolated in each one of those buckets. And you can't just round it because somebody might not be able to do the function of some other piece, and it might be a limited, scarce resource. So you might have a portfolio that you're selling, but you might actually have a high scarcity in, let's say it's payroll. We'll just use that as an example. I only got 2 payroll specialists. You go ahead and sell a bunch of services on a subscription, on a package deal across the span of services that we have. Well, I now have a limited set of resources that I can do, and I've got to pull less efficient resources into that mix. Now it's essentially its cost is going up. And so you have to understand the mix, the balance, the timing, and also the duration of what's happening there. And I think that's what I struggle with. That's what I think through in terms of I'm looking at what are the roles, what is the capability in those roles, how can they be spread across, and what is the mix that's going to consume that over whatever the time period is, and can it meet the requirements that you've set? And I think that's very much independent of when we're talking about subscription and billing and what you're getting on the revenue line, because resource and those they have to work complementary, but they may not be in alignment in terms of exactly how they're being perceived.
You almost have to bring into the mix what's in sports is known as a depth chart, right? Of the skill matrix kind of thing.
Because at the end of the day, if I don't have resources, it's just going to keep going up the ladder of command. It's still, I'm the owner. I'll get in there and get the payroll done. It's the worst use of the resource because it's probably the most expensive one. And, but it's what has to be done to get to what's right for the client.
To get the throughput right for the client. Wow. Well, to be continued, but we have an exit question that we ask all of our guests, Ian, and that is, who is a hero of yours and why are they a hero?
I think it's actually a bit timely at just where we are in the season. So my hero is actually my dad. I don't know that's a classic standard answer, but my dad was in the military for 35 years. He worked 3 jobs, and what he taught me was perseverance. He taught me about the fact that everybody here is as equal and as important as everybody else. Nobody is above that. I was born to, my mom was a teacher, my dad was in the military, my grandparents was a beautician, my other grandparent was a janitor, and the other side of my family was farmers. And so, your job here is to make the world a better place. And your job is to be committed to what you think is impactful and important. And those sit with me. And I feel like the service that he did isn't necessarily as appreciated, but it can be appreciated by the acts that we do in trying to drive things forward. And so mine isn't in that same sort of things that he does, but mine is into the profession. And I wouldn't have done what I did with starting the business that we had 8 years ago, and I wouldn't be as committed if it wasn't for the fact of that upbringing. And
lastly, Ian, how can somebody contact you?
If you Google my name, you can get every information about me. You could probably find my personal address, but, go ahead and email me at ian@KarbonHQ.com or just search my name and you'll get it. But I'm just like you, Ed. I'm accessible to anybody at any time. I love this stuff. This is for me, this is the things I can think about and talk about all the time.
All right, Ian Vacin, thanks so much for being a guest on the Sage Thought Leadership Podcast.
Review and subscribe by searching your podcast player of choice for Sage Thought Leadership Podcast.